If you already follow me, you probably know what I'm about to say. But if you don't, here, this is a pretty simple one. It's called an acoustic resonance pump, but it's actually two pumps for what it's worth. And they can work off of piezoelectrics, like I talked about in my Gray Life channel on rctestflight. Because it was like, well, he's trying to come up with the most efficient design for his propeller. And I'm like, yeah, spinning something though is kind of stupid. If you want to direct to action something in terms of a pump, then piezoelectrics is your best bet, or solenoids that fire in multiple spots, or even an air or hydraulic fluid. In my instance, I would use hydraulic fluid as a phaser array for larger to then medium, then to smaller, kind of like laminar flow does. So they'll take a larger tube to a medium-sized tube that intersects it, and to a bunch of smaller tubes that intersect those medium-sized tubes. But they go from a funnel-like design down to essentially a bell end, horn-like effect at the end. Most pumps that are acoustic resonance types pumps that are supposed to thrust do this. Now, the reason I was talking about it is because it's like, well, piezoelectric is 90% efficient at converting electricity directly to mechanical work, which is why they're so often used for that very thing. They often also, however, don't have a large amount of movement unless designed specifically to do this. Okay? So, it's like, well, yes, it's totally feasible to 3D print it and even run shielded wires with inside of the plastic and even cool it such that the water isn't close enough to allow for a type of circuit grounding effect. Like, all of it can be done, right? Now, the reason why I talk about it is because it's like, well, it can work with water, and we use them often with espresso. And they can even heat things because of resonance frequencies that are very similar to how we use for refrigerant lines. And the James Webb Telescope happens to use exactly this. Okay? But what you might not know is it works with laser light, electromagnetic fields, mechanical, and electrostatic fields. And so what that means is for air, it's great. Okay? Like, you can pump like a thrusting turbine incredibly fast, and they're hyper efficient at being able to essentially use the very fuselage of like an airship or an airplane as an actual pump that's great at moving things around and even creating a active noise canceling zone and separating air around it such that it stays pocketed where it's at for an airship. An airplane is a little different, of course. It has thrust, so that works. But just like piezoelectrics will convert electricity into mechanical motion, just like most people know electric motors these days can be turned into a generator, well, piezoelectrics can do the same thing. You step on it and create mechanical stress, it creates electricity. 90% efficient electricity. Which is why they're pretty big on my bladeless turbine fan, which is not a fan, but it's a turbine for hydroelectric dams. So that way fish can go through without the need or effort that they currently do, or even undamming processes. Which is why I built it, because I saw it come up in my feed for a bladeless turbine, and I'm like, that's lame. Why is it moving? Why is it shaped like a hemisphere? This is dumb. Why do you do this? Just do this. It's direct one-to-one conversion. If you resonate it properly, you get an AC. If you want a DC, you can do a DC. For water that gets pumped through. And then it's a Stirling and a hydrodynamic pressure, meaning it moved this fast, so it's slower. It moved that fast, so it moved this fast. And creates mechanical stress and strain and linear generation, which is perfect. That's an acoustic resonance. So it's like, well, for water pumps, that's great. They're extraordinarily efficient. And they are tunable to very high speeds. But if you use two, it's even better. See, if you use two, that means you can add in fuel to burn. This is why I talk about it as an air pump. If you pump in air and it has a basically version like a Tesla valve where it's lower amounts of resistance coming in and higher amounts of resistance coming out, it then gets pushed in between two dividers, this fuel and a little bit of air. It then collapses like a compression ignition. It then burns and continuously produces greater degrees of pressure. As pressure gets then added into the rear, instead of making electricity, we use that given pressure and the oscillational, meaning if we do it here and here and here, forward, outer, middle, center, middle in between outer and center, rear, you end up causing a continuous resonant spike wave frequency that you can capture and then thrust through the rear even faster and then capture it through a given type of bell end. It's extraordinarily efficient because that pressure gets used as a resonance, and then you can constantly fire it through as a continual thrust as you can delay it a little here, this goes a little faster, and it all comes out as a consistent stream, which is great. Add a little bit of extra electricity, all you need is hydrogen. Or if you want, you can use an ionic version, which uses essentially nitrogen and oxygen separated by a filter. That nitrogen gets ionicked and oxygen becomes more plasma. Then they combine, explosively decompose, and effectively burn our atmosphere but come out as N2. It produces an exothermic for the given electricity, right? Which you have to have batteries, but this is a range extending type of design, especially if you understand you only need a vacuum inside of the wing and the fuselage with batteries in the right places to keep them cool and still provide enough electricity alongside of piezoelectrics in the wings, fuselage, and solar panels. Mechanical stress and strain, higher buoyancy and lift, a greater degree of captured energy, electricity, you then are able to pump more efficiently. I talk about this design in one of my previous videos, although I'm not going to link it because this will just be the new one. So it'll work out just fine. But the point is like it's great for an airship, right? And it's perfect for most aircrafts, for us worth. It's pretty darn efficient at helping, especially with hydrofoil designs of cargo ships or various ships like that. Then the elephant in the room turns into, well, I did it mostly for rctestflight because I was talking about this toroidal that's more of an impeller swept forward wing kind of aircraft. You know, like if you ever see those aircrafts that have swept forward wings, what you'll know is that they turn in really fast. They love to turn in. And so if you sweep them with the toroidal curve properly, and then you have a leading edge like whale fin bump design, which I forget, there's apparently some actual name for it. I don't really care what it is right now, but point is that breaks it up, reduces initial onset pressure drag. If you curve it with these trailing waveguides and then effectively turn them in, but also have them do a little nice vortexy vortex, which I know that sounds so lame to do, but they essentially create a bigger vortex that combines into the next trailing edge like a swept back wing on a supersonic and hypersonic aircraft. Then it joins into the impeller area, which then elongates that shock wave in its speed, and it reduces vortex effects that are negative. We turn the vortex into a positive as that pressure wave, as it collapses onto its same spin, will also push forward. And so it balances itself at various RPM depending on the speed of where you are in the water. So they call them knots, but it's like RPM is not indicative in a lot of actual aspects of true speed through water. And of course, there are obvious balance points, right? And so, depending on the application and the torque provided, just like he says, there are higher efficiency designs for that and lower efficiency designs. And so, like, it's a great idea, especially when you add in some like little scoops on the leading edge and the trailing edge that allow for water as it's trying to get curved in, and it creates this little lower pressure at the top that actually has it skip off, gets sucked into a faster, even lower pressure underneath. That's where the toroidal is, that has a in between faster moving pressure that's joining into the waveguides below. And if you do that appropriately, it then basically, for the given torque that you have and the given forward swept and trailing for the type of design that is, you get more and more efficiency even if you are at higher RPM, because the faster it goes, it does the Bernoulli's principle, and it creates effectively this outer bound area that's just on the outside of it that has a shock wave. Well, not really a shock wave, because it's not driving that fast, but it has a wave of pressure that goes backwards after it collapses forward, like a pulse jet. And so like that bounces off and it forces it to effectively stay more concentric with where it is. Now the best way to get around it has always been, shocker, a singular fan shroud or propeller shroud. Like, it is so much easier to just simply put a shroud on there and then you don't have to deal with it anymore. But this will get around it to a degree, and it helps with your thrust for efficiency. But that becomes a large amount of research and development and trial and error. You know what's easy? A hydraulic fluid and a bunch of solenoids and some piezoelectrics and acoustically resonating for the various not RPM, but speed, velocity through the water. That's all you really need, because that's it. That's all you need to have higher efficiencies for the given use of your given amount of electricity. But that's because resonance pressures are such that you can continuously accelerate it every time you grab it and then move it through, which is a lot easier to go and do than a large amount of other designs. Now, the reason why I talk about this for vacuums is because in the vacuum of space, when you have a chamber in between, like I was talking about for like a jet engine, because that can also help pump that movement and resonance frequency, can help pump from burning things more fuel in, right? Which is great. However, in the vacuum, of course, you don't have air. So what you end up doing is you seal the front, you pump in at the front where the seals are by having them go flat and extending and slotting in. You can already do that more often than not already. But what that means is, that means there's air here that you're going to combust in the middle, and then during that you can heat it up acoustically and resonate it in its own little type of chamber, and then have some come out. It's hot, you can plasmify it, and then you can ground and electrify ionic. Let's say it was hydrogen and oxygen. Well, oxygen is pretty easy because ozone can be created. And plasma from hydrogen, while not stupendously easy, is easier than oxygen usually, especially when you can get it hot. Dump it in, it creates a consistent burn that helps pump it in after for the front and into the combustion chamber. Then you can still thrust it faster after and capture it with a very good acoustic resonance bell end. So as it goes from a nozzle area and you are done accelerating it, you then capture it as it expands in a more efficient manner, so you don't need a bell end nearly as big, but then it comes out as, well, slow as reasonably possible, kind of, for given captured equal opposite types of conventional Newtonian law physics. That will also help pump it like a turboprop to pumping it in, while also gaining thrust, which is great, because you're going to want that. It gives you a higher Q value of delta E. You don't need to run as big pumps. You don't need to run as much in terms of shielding for heat, especially when you can still cool it using this type of technology. And it can still slide thanks to that, ultimately, material around the piezoelectrics and diaphragms that you'd be using. Alright? Things can bend a lot easier than they can rotate on an axle. That kind of thing. So, that's what it's for. A water, air, vacuum, and then plasma, shocker, is effectively the same thing. It's light, electromagnetic, electrostatic, current flow. Then there's a Z-pinch with standard light resonances, and you guessed it, good old mechanical. Which means I can always have a ceramic that's there that happens to be cooled by a, well, liquidized gas that happens to also have coils that allow for very high degrees of efficiency, like piezoelectrics, right? That can also still move plasma around very efficiently. Now, it's not no moving parts, but it can be very close to that. As it can undulate, you increase degrees of valving and Tesla-like valving and check valves one way. You increase efficiencies in space for the given electricity you're eventually going to put out as a result. Now, the reason why I made it was because this combined with light on the bell end area and inside that we're reflecting and also putting in as wavelength frequencies to constructively interfere turns into a very powerful laser, but also plasma that's incredibly precisely aligned, like a laminar, right? So I call it a Lemke flow, personally, just because I thought of it, but then I'm sure they already have their own version, so I don't really ever care. To me, it turns into, this is a given pulse rate frequency, very specific wavelength frequency that's matching it. It turns into a very ordered state of plasma that allows for you to condense it using the correct area around it, like a tube, that allows for a pinch point that then you can shine more light into and fuse. You can inertial confinement fuse. As it becomes more and more able to pulse back and forward like a two-stroke engine, as it heads towards its pinch point and then gets grabbed and then fired with lasers at that area, you can heat it up, force it into a tighter and tighter confinement, and attempt a type of entanglement and degree of superpositioning in which they will try to increase their tunnel probability. And then in the next bell end, and now we have a real fusion engine for space. Not for on the ground, because of course what's coming out is very fast, very hot plasma that is probably not something you want to be around, or very easy, because it's like a freaking oxyacetylene torch that's in the millions of degrees C. Says, yo, look at me and my lightsaber. Psh, no! Don't do this! No! 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 But it's theoretically possible. Effectively, all the parts are already known. Now, for me, for capture of it, just usually turned into, I'll shove it into effectively a percolator set up through water. And that's not even a joke. I'm really actually not kidding. So think water is at the top, there's a percolator, there's an overhang, and then there's a bunch of tubes that have the correct magnets and a light that's resonating and working off of the light that's coming off the plasma. As it goes and gets pushed through, it then overpressures, bubbles down, and then it goes through all the water, right? Well, of course that creates steam, but it's also shocker if you put a piezoelectric box there and you put some, of course, steam turbines. I'm not saying no to that. You're then able to capture a decent amount of the given heat and mechanical pressure energy into electricity. It's all more, for me, about how much energy it would take. It makes total sense if you're able to get it done as a prototype for space travel. But it makes a lot less sense if you're trying to have something effectively melt into a body of water that's hoping to be cooled off by that body of water, which if it happens to flash steam essentially, which great, I got ignition fusion, super, right? And it's like I was able to keep it going, and then eventually I was able to put the electricity I got kind of like an alternator, and then I was able to take some of it out, so I have a high Q value now than what I'm putting in, right? Super great. Which is that's nice, right? But how long until the tube breaks? How long until neutron degradation happens? How long until all of those problems effectively overwhelm the system? It's a great concept for me, but most of the time I never used it. Like, I had this concept from back in the day that's essentially the same thing. But I eventually learned that if you're able to entangle and superposition, fired plasma or close to that for certain atoms, right? Then you're able to fuse them a lot more easily on a smaller scale. Which means you don't need big, huge rocket engines, and in fact that means you can put a whole bunch that just fire directly into water. Which is a lot easier and a lot less likely to neutron degrade everything. Instead of needing a big long tube and a percolator setup, which super cool, sure, but you know what I mean? Yeah, it's like I can just fire direct like helium or whatever plasma into the thing, and that'll be good enough. And the extra pressure of air and steam, and then the separation of that helium from that given steam is possible using basic buoyancy distilling methods as it cools off with using a piezoelectric radiator and a basin of, a big enough, large enough body of water that can capture that level of increased wattage energy. Then you also happen to make heavy water, which means you have an easier time over time of turning that also into fused helium. So that's really what I usually used it for, mostly on the tops of mountains with water battery like effects for a body of water at the top that it would heat up with very small versions of this in the basin of water in the wall of the basin that had piezoelectrics throughout and the tubes and everything that were insulated, of course, to allow it to go to the turbines and then go to the cooling piezoelectric radiator for waste heat from high steam, high pressure, high temperature steam versus, this is hot water and this is, much colder steam comparatively, that will eventually, from its most likely some amount of decomposition will be there, will recombine when it gets cold enough, which is fine. That's fine. I can still use that for turbines. That's a lot easier than if I were to try and build a big tube and whatnot. But there's a reason why I usually put them on top of mountains, because it's like it's far enough away, it's away from everybody. Go away. There's water up there. That's a water battery, right? You know what I mean? And that goes higher up. Now it's colder, right? That's the Stirling radiator, piezoelectric mechanical stress and strain. That's, heating and cooling. It moves and it creates a mechanical stress and strain diaphragmic, kind of like a pop, toy, uh, pump for water skis or whatever, the little toy. It's similar, but it's a bigger scale for radiator movement, right? And then it's like, then it goes back down into the water basin, or if you want to take some of that out to try and filter, on its way down to being filtered from heavy water versus regular water, then you're able to get that captured electricity from the water battery, right? But then also you're able to add in, if there's, because it's on a mountain, any rainwater or other water capture from humidity and so on into the system, which is nice. And also I can shield the shit out of it, and deep into the mountain it goes, and I don't have to worry about it. And that one was a thought for the Rocky Mountains over here that we have in Arizona. It was like, well, in more towards the northern Arizona down to Phoenix, then that's a big long water battery, right, all the way down to Phoenix. And I could use fusion, if we're able to get it done. And it turns out that it's doable. That then can also have water capture and recycling, to effectively make what is equivalent of fusion energy finally viable. But the vast majority of it comes from, you guessed it, simple buoyancy and heat as a water battery. You know what I mean? So it's like it's able to make electricity from just fusion, right? But it's like, well, we're drinking heavy water. Is that negative? Like, there's always this really, honestly, very small amount to begin with in all water. So, you'd have to run it for a really, really long time before you'd have to worry about it, which is okay for what it's worth. That would be fine. And then you can always point them up and angle them such that this actually helps with the steam creation and helps with the pumping of that steam and recycling of its given heat, right? But that also means you can replace the shroud, because like if that gets neutron degraded, then you can take out that part which captures the steam into the turbines and then put a new one back, which is a lot easier to do when it's pointed up and away from everybody into the good old-fashioned space around us, versus near anyone. And I'll take that every dang day. I'll take that all day. You know what I mean? So, but the caveat is, of course, you can still filter it along the way until the point where it gets to Phoenix and get rid of any and all possibility of radioactivity, which there should be very little. But that's to make people less afraid of it, more than anything. And then you can supplement the water. My thought process was of a water sewage treatment and organic matter, and most plastics actually are able to do this, especially like polyethylenes and so on, where you can use heat and pressure, because like we need this to cool down pretty decently, but really it's not about the cooling down. It's more about, if I use the pressure of a lot of sewage into an area and then I heat up that area and I make sure that the filtration has either been done before or after, or both, really, then you get plastics, organic waste material, fecal matter, and water, all your sewage, right, to be treated and broken down. You get hydrocarbons out, a large amount of them. You can filter out still nutrient-rich, organic material that's basically fertilizer. So that means there's still going to be nitrogen-rich compounds. There's still going to be, vitamins and minerals. There's still going to be carbon that's there. You'll be able to separate out the sodium, the salt, from that, and still be able to get some amount of that graphite or other forms of carbon and make sodium ion batteries from sewage, which is nice, I feel. And luckily enough, urea and ammonia and other compounds, fecal matter and more, are helpful in the hydrothermal pyrolysis reaction at creating natural gases, liquid gases, petrols, liquid fuels, and some kinds of solid fuels. Although, again, we're talking about micro to nano size graphite particles at most, some possible graphene, yes, but that's not what I would be doing it for. I just like the idea of, ooh, we get fertilizer, we get batteries, and we get hydrocarbons and clean water that when it goes buoyant and then it has to eventually come back down, we just have to remineralize, right? And then no more PTFEs, no more forever chemicals, no more medicines that we can't seem to filter out, no more random DNA crap, no more any of the stuff that we don't want. And it's a water battery. So it's like in a water tower or wherever it is you manage to cool it off, then can be used as water pressure down to any of the town or city folks below. You just got to make sure you watch it so that way it doesn't get vandalized or gone after by either teenagers, kids, adults that are drunk or whatever it is. But they are kind of annoying after a while. You do need to, of course, insulate it. You need to make sure it doesn't freeze in the right places by putting some light tubes around. That helps keep it warm. You can always make sure you don't cool it off as much with that radiator, right? The piezoelectric radiator. And then that allows for it to remain a little bit warmer during the winter, which is, just fine for what it's worth. I mean, just above freezing, 33 degrees Fahrenheit, cold water is not the greatest thing ever. I'm already shivering from it. But, some people might want that, but the point is as long as it's still good mineralized water, because at this point it's distilled, and that can be not great to drink, so you have to remineralize it. You cannot cheap out on that, right? So that's it. But I came up with that as like, hey, well, why not? Why not? I don't see why don't we do this? There's hydrothermal pyrolysis. We can turn fecal matter into like methanes, nitromethanes, liquid gasoline, ethanols, biodiesels. We can filter that so it doesn't smell like insanely terrible, which is good. Why wouldn't we do this? I mean, we have this technology ready, actually, at this point. Now, collection of fecal matter or something for humans we've got. I get it. It's so icky, but is it that bad? I mean, you're around cow turds or patties, right? I don't see why that's so much worse, but whatever, I mean, I feel like it's fine, personally, you know. That's where I ended it, because it was like, well, I didn't have that. That came about the fusion thing just because it was like, well, this is an interesting tackle problem. Like this would solve a lot of things. I mean, I can fire multiple beams of this plasma to continuously try and pump in higher heats and pressures until I can get to like irons or possibly even bespoke non-radioactive heavier elements, which was kind of the point of it. The problem was it became far more like the LHC levels of luminosity and then extraordinarily high velocities and heats to effectively create fusion up to that point. And yeah, sure, I was able to do it. Like, it's all theoretically, like, all of the science and physics says it's doable. As long as the two are at the right angle, the luminosity is there, you're able to recirculate it, keep heat pumping, and you're able to keep pump and resonate frequencies to increase moments of time when they can possibly hit and fuse, then you increase the likelihood chance of having these fusion reactions, right? The only problem was, of course, you have a higher degree of radioactivity, and you have a higher and higher degree of gamma radiation and neutron propagation and degradation, which isn't super great along with neutrinos, and so it starts getting pretty rough after a while. But like that was fine for my intergalactic type of engine that I wanted to make, because it makes an enormously large amount of sense when you can keep effectively burning fuel and passing through Jupiter and then coming back around to the sun, and then using that as a solar energy pump, and then you're able to effectively keep pushing more and more hydrogen into the system and helium into the system as you go through its atmosphere, and use that almost like a ram air with the resonance frequency pumps that you can run. And you can keep increasing pressures and heats until you eventually get to the point where you sustain like a higher degree of tunnel entanglement and fusion, right? For brief points of possible superpositioning, right? Where they're technically speaking in a superposition where they're already tunneled, is kind of what that really looks like to me. But all it really ends up meaning is that now it's like, well, I've got this thing spewing out iron or more, which has a large amount of gamma radiation and radioactivity. And it's very, very bright. And like, no, we could honestly have it last for a while. For what it's worth, it's very theoretically possible to have it such that the shielding and everything will sustain for quite a while. Right? There's electromagnetic, electrostatic, light, all that stuff. Right? And then it's like we top up our fuel tanks, and then we effectively point light in front of us in some electromagnetic fields near the body of the spacecraft, and try and essentially have like long poles that are electrostatic in front that try and corral a large amount of any hydrogen or charged particles into given intake ports to capture them and use them as extra fuel like a ram air, right? Which is fine to a degree, except I was like, well, it only lasts for so long, and I don't like this, and everything about that annoys me. Shocker, I'm that guy. So I was like, so how do I use quantum vacuum pressure and then grabbing essentially a bunch of random impossible quasi and virtual particles, separating them possibly by charge differences, and essentially what they should be attracted to, right? So it's like laser light, the charge differences and all that. With electromagnetics, grab them, separate them before they collapse on it themselves and create pressure. So it's like I'll take that and then I'll ram them together as hard as I can, because I got enough electricity for it's worth, considering this would be like a tremendous amount of electricity that you could get off of like fusion just from the engine alone. And so then it turned into like, all right, well, I also have a lot of light, so I can use the light from the engine. It's like I don't really need that much. Hell, that's a lot of light. You know what I mean? So it's like, all right, so and then I'll start it off with a basic sort of bioreactor. So it's a fuel cell. We have fuel cells right now for hydrogen and oxygen, right? They're very efficient, which is why I looked at it. So it's like, well, bacteria of a certain kind produce electricity, and then if we have them also more either alkaline or acidic with more salinity or various things like that, then we're able to create what is essentially a type of fuel cell, that creates electricity upon eating material. And so if I have a terrarium and then it slowly grows with enough electricity, and it's got its periods of seasonal change, it grows, and then the carbon cycle, all of that stuff, right? Well, during all of that, I'm making electricity because I'm putting electricity in through the form of light. Well, I need electricity. Well, this is a very highly efficient, long-lasting type of battery. It's a bioreactor battery. Well, I eventually have to burn some of the bacteria because they'll outgrow ultimately their food source. So it's like, well, that's fine. I can use that and put it back in. And because there's heat of a effectively fusion reactor and light around us, then I'm able to then place in a few extra batteries. There's battery generators or like a nuclear, fission reactor. And then I'm able to sustain it for an enormously long time. So it's like, all right, well, now if I can get that quantum vacuum, virtual particle separation and quasi-particle separation, then I'm able to form electrons and hydrogens eventually. I can fuse hydrogens. I love hydrogens. I want hydrogens. Now I have an intergalactic engine. It will always burn. It just needs to create enough hydrogen to sustain itself to make very fast, relativistic light speed, 99% plasma come out. Now, that just means eventually it'll have to turn off because I can't keep accelerating it. I mean, it's like I can always add more mass. That's extra force. That means I can always make it go higher and higher. Well, it's further and further away, which means it spreads out. But there's always this other issue of it definitely creates a signal. Okay, so signals mean it's got a decent amount of extra gamma ray. It's got a decent amount of extra neutron, fast velocity neutron, highly charged particles, which then turned it into I need to learn how to decay it using neutrons and also electricity, and wouldn't you have known it, destructive interference of light. Destructive interference light from plasma and a collapsing rotational field of plasma makes it such that as it expands, the light then interferes and creates a longer wavelength, which is great. We're wanting that so we don't have a bunch of gamma rays. But also, it diffuses the heat, the IR energy, more evenly. So you're not blasting a bunch of people wherever it is that you're going. Now, the issue is, of course, eventually it will no longer be able to get any more mass. So, it's like, alright, well, I'm getting nearer and nearer to light speed, and eventually you have to turn it off. Because, well, I hit the maximum max. So, the maximum max is mass and velocity of escaping gases. Now I have effectively a dead engine. How long can I sustain it? Right? Like, how long? Like, actually. And the answer, unfortunately, is about 50 years. Is a 50-year traveling up to around near light speed, where we're starting here, but then we'll hit very, very near light speed. And then that's our max. We can't go past that. So I always had an issue, but it's like, all right, so I'm putting around, but that's the end point. You know what I mean? Like that's fine. I can get the Series B and back within a couple of years, which was kind of what I really designed it for, as a test bed. But I eventually got to the point where I was frustrated because it was like, well, first off, I have a nuclear fucking fusion reactor behind me, and I don't like that. And I definitely don't like, having radioactive material. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like any of this stuff. So it's like, how do we make faster and light travel? And that's when the inertial acceleration engine came in. It's utilizing basic quantum physics. Obviously, electrons are moving and they have mass. Same thing with the nucleus, and there's chaotic thermal. So we don't have to order extraordinarily high degrees, but if we're able to slightly pause and tick and talk one area and another, and we input an increased degree, there's an opposite reaction, of course, as something moves, and then that's like the undulational acoustic resonance. Well, the opposite reaction can bounce off of something and still head the same way. It just needs to be resonated in between the other forward thrust. So thrust forward, bounce, thrust forward, most of it's absorbed towards a forward direction, but there's still some that hits, the rear. So we just need to increase degrees of tunnel probability and quantum vacuum pressures as it bounces. We have lower pressure here, higher pressure there, and it wants to slip in. Now, it takes electricity, like a piezoelectric, to do it, but it's very highly efficient. And instead of being illegal against, you guessed it, basic physics, it works directly with all the physics we currently have. It's tunneling probabilities and pressures, meaning likelihood chance here versus likelihood chance there. That increases pressure where you don't want to go and decreases pressure where you do, lowering resistance that direction. As for movement of thermal and a chaotic, it becomes far more ordered in a resonance, which then means you can wrap it around forward, sort of like a Peltier, right? But except that Peltier, instead of turning something, it tunnels to this other area and dumps it south in that direction as opposite force towards the direction that we wanted to travel. It takes energy, of course, to do that. I didn't say it didn't. Some of it can be somewhat passive. Some of it, of course, is going to need to be a lot more specific, is a better way to put it, because we're talking about field collapses. So it's like that opposite turns into a field potential that we then send back towards a forward. And so then it resonates between the two, right? So it's like, all right, and then we collapse, and then we move, and we collapse, and we move, and we collapse, and we move, and we collapse, and we move, right? And so pressure, quantum vacuumly speaking, becomes more ordered one way and less ordered another. Less ordered means more pressure, more ordered means less pressure. We slip through, we continue moving, and as relativistic speeds start to happen, we start to be able to curve a little bit of what we're moving around. Now, our special relativity view says it's traveling like it's always traveled, the same speed relative to itself. But to outside observers, of course, space and time can curve a little bit, which means we can start resonatively, acoustically, slipping through like we're almost not even there. Right? It still takes energy, though, which is fine because it's a lot less than it takes to fucking make a fusion reactor happen. I didn't say it's going to not. It just passively starts doing it as that energy of space-time curvature starts to actually be able to resonatively be added in. Just like the pump for sucking air in and then combusting gases and then expanding, that expansion of gases gets added into the intake of more fuel and air. That's what that would be. Which means eventually it becomes very, very low energy to the point where you almost have none being put in. It's not perpetual at all. I don't know why you believe that, but have fun with that. Anyways, have a good day. Like and subscribe. Please share. And bye.